Thank you very much, Peter. Good morning and welcome to our virtual meeting of Brampton's Audit Committee. We will begin with the meeting with the City Clerk calling the roll call for attendance at today's meeting.
Members of committee, I will call your name. Please indicate your presence. Councillor Santos. Councillor Santos.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Willens.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Paleshi.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Bowman.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Singh.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Dillon. I do not see Councillor Dillon in the meeting. And Member Jane.
Present.
Thank you. And Member Zaman is not present currently. And as I mentioned previously, Member Ali will not be attending today's meeting for personal reasons. So you do have quorum, and the chair is present. So you do have quorum, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Peter. Our next item is approval of the agenda. Does any members wish to add a business item to today's meeting? If so, please use the chat function in WebEx to add your name to the speakers list. I see none, so I do have a motion moved by Councillor Santos to approve the agenda, that the agenda for the Audit Committee meeting of February 23rd be approved as published and circulated. Is there anyone opposed to this motion? Okay, there are no objections, so the motion carries. Do any members have a declaration of pecuniary interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act for any matter to be considered on today's agenda? Okay, seeing none, the clerk will so note for the meeting minutes. Consent committee, as part of our new consent motion process, I will read each agenda item that is subject to the consent motion. Any member may identify the item to be held for debate during the meeting. Any item not held for debate will be considered as part of the consent motion and voted on for approval. Any of the following agenda items will not be subject to the consent motion for approval: delegations, presentations, added new business, member discussion items, and public question period. I'll start reading the relevant agenda items, and members can identify any items to be held for debate. First item is item 6.1, staff report regarding corporate fraud prevention hotline update.
Mr. Chair, Councillor Paleshi has indicated to hold that item in the chat.
Okay, so noted. Thank you, Councillor Paleshi. Item 6.2, staff report regarding status of management action plans.
Hold, please.
Okay, Councillor Santos, thank you. Item 6.3, staff report regarding building design and construction. Diagnostic review, 6.3. No, okay, that's in consent. 8.1, staff report regarding data and analytics strategy implementation update. Item 8.1. Okay, that's in consent. Item 11.1, open meeting exception under section 239 of the Municipal Act, security of property in the municipality or local board. Okay, so 11.1 is in consent. So the clerk will summarize these items to be included on the consent motion for approval.
Mr. Chair, members of committee, items 6.3, 8.1, and closed session item 11.1 will be added to the consent motion. Item 6.1 is held by Councillor Paleshi. Item 6.2 is held by Councillor Santos.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a motion moved by Councillor Paleshi to approve the consent motion. So noted by the City Clerk. Does anyone oppose? Oh, I believe it's a recorded vote, so I'll ask the City Clerk for a recorded vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a recorded vote for approval of the consent motion. All in favor, please indicate. Councillor Santos.
Yes.
Councillor Willens.
Yes.
Councillor Paleshi.
Yes.
Councillor Bowman.
Yes.
Councillor Singh.
Yes.
Councillor Dillon is not yet present. Member Jane.
Yes.
Member Zaman. Member Zaman. Mr. Chair, he just left the meeting, is just coming back in.
Okay.
Member Zaman, this is a recorded vote on the approval of the consent motion for some of the items that were identified for consent. Do you vote in favor or against?
I vote in favor. Sorry
you.
about that. I've been having some technological issues this morning.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, that motion carries unanimously 7-0 with a few absences.
Thank you, City Clerk. Our next item then is item 6.1, Corporate Fraud Prevention Hotline Update. And there is a staff report, item 6.1, and I know Councillor Pelushi asked for it. So if there's any questions or comments, I'll hand it over to Councillor Pelushi to lead us off. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think to start, I did want to have a discussion about some of these items holistically, not really to each one, but the questions that I have, I believe, are better related to maybe having that as an in-camera discussion. So if there were any other members that wanted to ask questions directly about this report, I'll hold that. But I would like to maybe just, Peter, if you could help me out here, I think just refer it to our in-camera portion and to be dealt with when we come out of that.
So through you, Mr. Chair, at this point, there will not be an in-camera portion as the in-camera item was added to consent and was received. But if there is a need for this committee to proceed into closed to discuss specifics related to this item, I'll look to, I don't see legal on the call yet, but we'll have to identify the reason
here,
if it's
Peter.
security of the property of the corporation.
I'm here, Peter. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, sorry, City Solicitor.
I think this could be under security of property of the corporation.
So, Mr. Chair, then my advice would be if there's public questions on this, those can be dealt with in public, and then at the appropriate time, if committee still wishes to proceed into closed session, they could proceed into closed for the open meeting exception of security of the property of the corporation.
Okay, so I guess Councillor Pelushi, then you will hold your questions. I do see other members of committee. Do you have anything that you'd be able to ask in public, or do you just want to wait for the in-camera discussion?
I'll wait for the in-camera. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Pelushi. Member Zeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everybody. My apologies for logging in and out of the meeting this morning. I've been having some technology issues. I guess thank you, first of all, to Internal Audit for bringing forward this update, on the fraud hotline. I've got a couple of questions here, just following up on the discussion related to the corporate fraud hotline that we had at the last audit committee meeting. I think one of the requests that I'd made was for Internal Audit to consider whether it's appropriate to extend this hotline to residents and going beyond just employees, to extend it to possibly city residents or vendors or other outside parties as well. So, Internal Audit followed up on that. They provided some benchmarking work here, in comparing that possibility to what other cities are doing, and also outlined the cost implications here, right? So thank you very much for that. I just wasn't sure if Internal Audit actually had a particular recommendation in this regard in terms of what the preferred course of action would be. Are you Internal Audit recommending that this hotline be extended beyond employees or no? And I guess just on a related note, the other question was, I noted that there's the renewal of the contract with the third-party service provider here. That's coming up for renewal next month as well. I guess my question is, were you seeking any direction from this committee in terms of whether that should be renewed and whether it should be extended or not?
Hello, is there staff from Audit?
Thank you, Chair. Richard Gervais should be able to respond.
Forgive me, I forgot to unmute. Thanks for the question, and through the chair. We weren't looking to make a recommendation at this time. There was none provided. It's not part of the report. There are some costs that aren't necessarily fleshed out here, which would be the impact on resources and such. And to the second question, license is up for renewal at the end of the month. If we choose to move ahead with opening up the line to the members of the public, we may need to go to a broader purchasing process. Right now, the offer we've been given is under a 4-year agreement, and the total cost of the contract may exceed thresholds, and we may have to go to tender. What we can do, and what was recommended by the purchasing department, is we can request a 1-year extension. The current contract actually expires. The current contract expires at the end of this month, so we can go. Purchasing suggested we can apply for a 1-year extension at the current rate, and the vendor has agreed. That way, we'd have we would have continuity of service while the city decides what the next steps are. There are other activities going on concurrently to this. Streamline the complaint process. So and we're debating the Auditor General role, and we're bringing an ombudsman. So it made sense at this point to look at simply renewing the contract for another year. So that's what I proposed. That's it.
Thank you so much. So I think that sounds like a reasonable approach given the backdrop of some other changes that might be underfoot there as well. I guess I look to the chair here and possibly the clerk here in terms of how would we move forward with the recommendation that this contract be extended for the 1-year timeline if that's the direction that's being sought from this committee, and B, my recommendation would be while we're extending it for the 1 year, we extend it to outside parties' residents. I think there was an option for an additional $6,000 cost for web-only reporting for outside parties to be able to do that. We could possibly move forward for that for the first year and see if there are any learnings for us, whether it's even appropriate to have that open to external parties moving forward there as well. So that would be my suggestion there. So I'll look to the chair and clerk to see how we can possibly move this forward administratively here, I guess.
So I think, member, the first question, would you be then, I hear a motion in that, and City Clerk, you can help confirm it. But in fact, I think that if you would like to move that, Member Zaman, that's an appropriate motion. I'll hand it, Peter, if you have any comment.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So I believe Member Zaman is seeking option 2 in the attachment to the report, which, because you'd mentioned the additional $6,000 cost, which is opening up the fraud and waste hotline to city staff and residents for web and phone only for city staff and web only for citizens at a estimated pricing for 2021 of $16,000 for under the existing contract for staff, and additional $6,000 for access to residents. Is that your intent, Member Zaman?
That is correct, yes.
And in terms of the contract extension, I don't know, and perhaps the acting internal auditor director can clarify if that already exists within the current terms of the contract for the extension, and whether or not, if it does, I'm not sure if a motion is required on that particular point. But on the option 2, that could be a motion that's introduced.
To the chair. So the base rate just requires an extension, a contract extension. I'm not sure about the $6,000, although I think this cover comes under my signing authority, so we could approve this for a year. I'll need to confer with purchasing on that.
Okay, fair. Yeah, no, thank you very much. And I guess just to clarify again, then that 1-year option, do you need direction from this committee to extend it for 1 year?
Through the chair, no. We can proceed.
Okay, City Clerk, would you want to see that in the motion, or are you fine with staff's response?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm fine with staff's response, but if committee wants the assurance through the motion, then that's up to committee. But it looks like staff have the authority to proceed with the extension.
Yeah, I would think it would be in the motion just to be clear on the direction. So pursue a 1-year extension. If Member Zeman is fine with adding that, just to ensure that that's clear and it's in writing.
That looks good to me, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So are you fine then? I can move on?
I do have one other question. I'm
Okay,
not sure
go
if
ahead.
the motion needs to be put to vote or how that might work.
So Chair, it's David here. I just, on this option 2 item, I want it to be completely transparent. With respect to the costs, it does reference $16,000, but we know in the analysis that's been put forward, opening it up to the public could generate, when you look at Hamilton as well as Ottawa and other municipalities, an additional 200 or more complaints coming in annually, which is fine, with the exception that that may require an additional staff resource moving forward as well. So not only is it the $16,000, you know, I'll certainly pass it back to Richard, but there could be consideration of an additional staff person depending on the volume coming in. Again, which is fine, but I just want to make sure that committee has that awareness that the resource impact could be beyond the licensing fee.
Okay, thank you, CAO. Member Zeman, would you like to ask your other question, please?
Sure. I guess the other question, again, following up on one of the items from the last audit committee meetings, you know, I think we had requested for internal audit to sort of, you know, go away and study and provide an update on what the whistleblower policies are here at the city and how the city protects any employees from reprisal if they bring forward any sort of, you know, perceived unethical conduct, whether that's through this hotline or whether that's through other internal reporting mechanisms. So just wanted to check in to see if internal audit wants to bring that forward at a future meeting or what their plan is in regard to updating us about the whistleblower policies of the city.
Do staff have any comment?
Through the chair?
Yep.
I don't have that information with me. I do know there's a whistleblower section in the existing fraud hotline policy, but I will pick that up and report back at the next audit committee.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Member Zeman. And our next question is Councillor Santos.
Thank you, through you, Chair. In reading the report, I had noticed that a majority of the complaints coming in through the fraud hotline were HR related. And so I'm just wondering if we can get clarification on what the process is when there's an HR complaint that comes forward through the hotline.
Through the chair, the director of internal audit triages all the kits that come in through our provider. If it's determined that the issue is personnel is related to personnel relations, the issue will be directed either to human resources or may be dealt with by the director. So there's a couple of issues that came in where the director simply responded to the complainant and gave them the information they needed to, and the processes and the policies in dealing with these matters. And in terms of another group of complaints, an external consultant was hired to do a review.
So does the HR department get involved at all when these complaints come through?
So the nature of the calls, 2 of them were handled by internal audit, did not go to HR. And I see Sandeep. I think she would to speak to this. Did you want to speak to this, Sandeep?
Sure. Actually, Richard, I'm just building on what you've shared already, but through the chair to the councillor, we don't get any information about the nature of the complaints, the list of the complaints, or the body of the complaint. But we get informed if there is a relevant complaint or a set of complaints for guidelines. And typically, as we do with any HR-related complaints, we provide the information related to the relevant policy, the relevant SOP, which then gets shared with the incumbent. And I believe that the previous internal audit director had done that. But I don't actually have any information about what is shared with those incumbents, whether they come back or not. But that's the extent of our involvement is if we're informed by internal audit, we don't actually get any material information except direction sought if it is relevant to an HR matter.
Okay, so that might be a little bit of a gap in the processes. I would imagine like there are two avenues for HR complaints to come forward that would be through the, looks like through the fraud hotline, but then also through HR directly. And in both instances, if the complaint is HR related, the process sounds like they're different.
So if I may, Councillor Santos, through the chair, we don't, so what I've understood is that the fraud hotline, the way it was established, the mandate and the scope, doesn't actually include HR related matters. So there are preset categories that an incumbent would choose from to categorize their report, and they're superimposed on what already exists. And I think in what you've highlighted, it's actually a gap where if someone wanted to submit an anonymous HR related complaint, there isn't that format right now, which is what the corporate policy team is working on to make sure that we do a review of all the different avenues through which complaints come in, and so that people are aware of what the appropriate mechanism would be to put those complaints forward. So we don't have that yet, but we're working on that.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to highlight that that's being worked on.
Yes.
Certainly because in this report, it looks like there were not necessarily many fraud related calls. They were mostly HR related. And my next question on that is, what happens if there is a complaint against a member of council through the fraud hotline, whether that's HR related or otherwise?
Through the chair. Policy states that the members of council are excluded from the policy. Any issues can be referred to the integrity commissioner. Back to the chair.
Thank you. And what happens to the original source of the complaint and the information shared within the source of complaint that is then referred to the integrity commissioner? Does the integrity commissioner, if that complaint is referred to the integrity commissioner, does that information and any evidence that is associated with that complaint, does that get sent to the integrity commissioner, or does the integrity commissioner start from scratch?
I don't have that, through the chair, I don't have that information with me right now. I will get back to you. I don't know if that's occurred in the time that we've had the hotline, but I will get back to you.
Okay, thank you. Because I'm starting to see, and it'll deal with some of my questions in 6.2, with respect to HR related matters, there might be some more gaps in the process with respect to city staff filing complaints against members of council, and whether or not it follows through the HR review policy or the fraud hotline, HR review process, or the fraud hotline process, or the integrity commissioner process. And so I just want to make sure that our employees at the city are protected appropriately when it comes to issues or complaints related to members of council. So if we could get more information on that, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Palaszczuk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I'll build off what Councillor Santos was saying and a better understanding. I guess to me, the fraud hotline, if councillors are exempt from the fraud hotline, then my understanding of that would be that there isn't an opportunity for them to put forward a complaint through the hotline. So there therefore would be nothing to refer to the integrity commissioner. And we would just I guess maybe it's stated in there, or maybe it's not. Maybe it's assumed that everybody knows if you want to file a complaint against a counselor, then you need to go directly to the Integrity Commission. Is that correct?
Through the chair, that is my understanding. However, I will review the process and come back with some clarity around that. I don't have the information with me.
Okay, and then just on the options on the go forward, and I don't mind supporting just kind of the 1 year to see because of what Council's future's decision may lie. I guess what I don't understand and I'd like more clarity on is opening this up to the residents. Currently, the residents have the ombudsman tool that they can report any of these types of complaint. Is that correct?
Through the chair, I don't have that information with me. Sorry.
Okay. So I guess from my understanding, it's residents can put forward any complaints they want through the ombudsman. So I don't know. I would like to know the benefit of this opening up more opportunity, if there is, by way of maybe asking Hamilton, Ottawa, and Toronto what their, maybe not Toronto, maybe Hamilton and Ottawa, what the impact was for their fraud hotline service, opening it up to the residents, if any. So that's a question that I would ask for that to come back. And then I'm not sure why Mississauga hasn't opened it up to the resident, and I don't know if that was put forward in front of them. So I think also the web and phone, from what I'm seeing, everything 100% of the calls are coming through by way of web. Has there been any reports or any complaints that have come through by phone?
Through the chair. So for the period in question that we just reviewed, from the information that I have, all the reports came through the web interface.
Okay, and I guess we don't know if there's ever been any like before this period. Has there been any complaints that have come through by phone?
I'll have to look into that.
Okay. So I don't know if there's maybe a benefit to the budget amount if we only offer it by web. If we even need it by phone, that I don't know. So if there's a separation of the 16,000 on that go forward, if it's only offered by web, then how much is that price? I guess would be a question that I'd have.
Through the chair, I just want to clarify. So 16,000 is the sort of the base cost for providing web and phone support to our employees. Extending it to the public, it goes up in increments. So web only is an additional $6,000. Web and shared phone number, another $9,000, and web and two separate phone numbers are $9,500. So opening up to the public will incur additional costs on top of the 16.
Yes, no, and sorry, I didn't clarify. What I'm referring to, the 16,000 is for city staff only. If we've never had anybody from the city pick up the phone to lodge the complaint, then at what point do we look at continuing to offer that? If 100% of everything is coming through by web, which I would assume that's the way that everybody feels a little bit safer lodging a complaint like this. So if that's the case, then maybe there's some savings where we don't have to offer it by phone anymore. But that being said, this is still new to the corporate, the corporate fraud prevention is something that we just implemented last term. So I don't want to start taking tools away from that. but I think it's something that we should keep an eye on. Those were my questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Pelosi. Member Jan.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. One thing we've seen with the fraud hotline here is that a big reason for success is the awareness and communication activities that support the hotline to ensure that employees have been aware. And I know there's been a lot of efforts to build that over the past year or so. Has there been any consideration on those types of activities happening across the resident base if we were to kind of inform and raise awareness about a resident-facing hotline here? I see that some of the other municipalities are investing in social media awareness and things like that. So wondering if there's any thoughts there, or whether it's too early given the scope of the work that's been done so far.
Through the chair, thanks for the question. It is early in the process, but if we do open this up to the public, when we do open this up to the public, there would have to be a communication campaign.
Okay. Okay. And then another question is then, would we have the option to, given some of these questions about additional costs, like the additional FTE, potentially, depending on the volume, and I guess I would echo Councillor Pelesi's comments about the benefits and understanding the benefits compared to the other avenues that are in place today for residents. Would we have an option to support the 1-year extension of the existing hotline, and then decide, like, come back next quarter with a fuller picture to understand the costs and benefits of extending it to residents, and then make that decision at that time? Just given that there's still, I think, some work to be done on projecting out those costs and benefits.
So thank you. I'll just intervene and probably City Clerk can confirm, but my assumption would be that you'd have the option to separate, as Councillor Pelesi suggested, move the first part of the extension, and the second part could be referred or deferred for report back or direction for report back on costs at the next meeting. But City Clerk, you can advise.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's correct. So I believe Member Jane is asking whether or not option 1 may be the one that's pursued, which is continue with staff only, and then extend it for a year, and then through that year look at the cost-benefit analysis of extending out to the public after that point. And I do agree with you, Mr. Chair, that you could vote on the second part of that motion in 2 parts, and if option 2 does not carry, then option 1 could be placed as a motion.
Yeah, and so the mover of the motion would be Member Zeman. So you know, if you wanted to put that forth, Member Jan, as a consideration, then he can take it as a friendly, or we would have to vote on it. But I will leave that for Member Jan to respond if Member Zeman to respond if you would like to pursue that option.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think, you know, based on some of the comments we've received from Mr. Barrick and Mr. Jan here, I think it makes sense to break it up into 2 options as the clerk has described, and instead of suggesting that we just simply take up option 2, maybe we can request for internal audit to study the costs and implications more fully and bring that back at the next audit committee meeting. So I'm happy to amend this to incorporate that, amend the motion to incorporate that suggestion.
Okay, thank you very much, and I'll go back to Member Jen. Do you have any further questions?
No further questions. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Singh.
Yeah, and I like that suggestion, so thank you to our citizen members. I think that while we look at and assess the ombudsman and having a municipal ombudsman and attorney general model, it makes sense to look at the costs that, you know, some of the functions that we're looking at for doing through the corporate hotline might actually be better done through an avenue. So thank you for holding on to that, and I think it's very timely. And just listening to councillor comments, if the concern is about councillor conduct, I don't know if the corporate fraud prevention hotline is the best avenue. And it's totally up to councilors if they want to pursue this. It might make sense to more look at our code of conduct and possibly embedding in there the safe workplace policy and other policies that councilors want to see the integrity commissioner or at least some person at the city or nominated by the city to be able to pursue. Because when it's HR directors or the CEO looking at council conduct, it puts them in a peculiar position, and that is the role of the integrity commissioner. So I'd be open if councilors really want to pursue this with seriousness to look at our code of conduct and maybe strengthening some of the language in there. And we do have the integrity commissioner coming to one of our meetings, I believe. So that might be valuable to bring up there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Santos.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, I just wanted to respond and be in support of the suggestion from Councillor Singh. Quick question to staff, though. Is an HR matter, because I think we've identified some loopholes or gaps in complaints associated with members of council. Is an HR matter within the mandate of the IC? And if the IC is investigating a complaint regarding an HR matter, what role does the HR department have to play in the investigation process?
Through the chair, the information that I have, and this is based on the calls since November 24th last year. Two of the calls, the director at the time provided the policies that dictated actions to be taken, and they provided information on how to escalate the call and how to report the call and different options. So the matter wasn't settled by internal audit. They provided the information to the complainant, and the issues were closed. The remaining issues were provided. The issue was, as Sandeep mentioned earlier, were details of the issues weren't forwarded to HR, but there was sufficient information to bring in a third party to assess the issue, and action was taken based on that.
Okay, so maybe I can ask the CAO or Sandeep to clarify if an HR matter is actually within the mandate of an integrity commissioner, or if an IC investigating an HR matter, what role HR actually has to play in providing evidence. So like I'm just concerned in terms of, so where does the complaint come from, right? So if the referral came from the fraud hotline, or if the referral came from HR and not necessarily directly from the complainant, what role does the fraud hotline and HR have to play in providing the evidence to the IC? Because what I'm concerned about are the loopholes, are the gaps that exist when it comes to holding members of council to account. And it is quite likely that the city staff, including our council office staff, don't necessarily know that it means going to the IC. And sometimes going to the IC means that complaint isn't dealt with right away. And I'm concerned because we see what happens, for example, with public officials like Julie Payette, when things get kind of delayed or dragged on or inappropriately dealt with because the processes with respect to working in a respectful workplace have loopholes and gaps, and employees don't have a proper means of navigating through the fraud hotline or the HR department or the IC, and then people just give up. And then when people just give up, or if they're too scared to go to the IC, then where do they go? So that's kind of where I'm getting at. If HR and or the CAO want to comment, that would be appreciated.
So thank you, through you, Chair. David here, and then perhaps if Sandeep wants to add as well. But in essence, the Integrity Commissioner will get involved solely with respect to Council's Code of Conduct. So if there's any complaints with respect to a councillor's Code of Conduct, the Integrity Commissioner would investigate that process. And that could include a complaint by an employee, but it should be about the Code of Conduct, not necessarily other HR policies. For example, the respectful workplace policy, while a councillor may be deemed to have violated the respectful workplace policy, there's no impact to the councillor for doing that. However, that could be tied into the Code of Conduct, and I think that's where the tie-in is. And then the Integrity Commissioner would recommend any action as a result, as it relates to the Code of Conduct. So that's a loose kind of connection, albeit it's not a direct HR policy violation that can be actioned. It would be tied to the Code of Conduct piece. With respect to the fraud hotline, as noted by Sandeep earlier, the corporate policy team is really putting together all of our existing complaint routes and avenues. And our intent is to put it on our public-facing website to determine which type of complaint you have should go where. And as noted by, I believe, Councillor Pleshy, the Ombudsman is always an option as well. But my understanding is the Ombudsman would like to see some internal process first. And if that's not satisfactory, then the Ombudsman is always that option. So some of the complaints that we've seen in this fraud hotline are by a handful of people, multiple complaints about the same person with respect to employee relations issues, which is beyond the scope of the fraud hotline or even the audit committee to get into employee relations issues versus specific fraud allegations or misuse of property and that type of avenue. So in these cases, those respective staff have been referred to the appropriate HR policy processes, and many instances have already been done. So yes, we're collecting all the various avenues and identifying some of those gaps, certainly to be able to bring some suggested changes forward. And that's on top of, as many members are aware, we're currently looking at a municipal ombudsman option, an auditor general model, which also will change the potentially the scope of how complaints get handled.
Thank you, and thank you for that clarification. And so I have some significant concerns about this because it sounds like our HR policies with respect to a respectful workplace are pretty tight for managers, directors, commissioners, and the CAO. But when it comes to a respectful workplace from the top and the board of directors, which are members of council, when it comes to members of council adherence to the respectful workplace policy, it is a lot looser and it is not as tight, because if an HR matter is referred to the IC can choose whether or not to deal with it or not, and maintain confidentiality within dealing with it or not. And so what happens if an HR complaint is sent to the Integrity Commissioner and it's not dealt with?
Sandeep, would you like to answer that one? If not, I can try.
So I don't actually have an answer for that. I'm not sure what would happen, but I do want to make one comment. So as David was mentioning, the connection is loose, but the policy itself does apply to the members of council and the mayor and all the staff within the mayor and council's offices. But because the direction in terms of process is the moment a concern or a complaint is coming about a councillor or the mayor, it gets redirected to Integrity Commissioner, the HR team does not handle it, does not investigate. And it's the Integrity Commissioner's discretion if they believe that HR or anyone else in the corporation would have relevant information that should be sought or included. But beyond that, I have no idea how IC makes a determination of when or who to engage for any investigation.
Thank you for that clarification, because I think that's another area in terms of where the gaps are. And again, I bring up the reference to Julie Payette, who got away with many years of bullying staff until it actually became public. And I'm sure that the Prime Minister had complaint processes in place, but it was the worst kept secret when it came to a public official having a track record of bullying staff. And my biggest concern to Julie Payette's point is that if we don't have a more objective way and consistent way of dealing with respectful workplace policy with respect to members of council, whether that's the treatment of their own staff or the treatment of the corporation staff as a whole, there is a problem, because there is an even stronger power authority dynamic there, because we are the board members of the corporation. And that right there, to Julie Payette's point, is why I'm very concerned. So thank you for answering those questions. Most of my questions were already answered with respect to 6.2 in this questioning process. So we will probably save more time.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I see no further comments or questions. Can I get a mover, a motion to approve the staff report, moved by members? Oh, we have a motion first, right, City Clerk?
Yes, Mr. Chair. And the motion's on the screen.
Okay. So I'll ask for a recorded vote on this, please.
Mr. Chair, I think since I had questions on the in-camera, when it comes back out, is the proper time to move the motions and move forward the report?
Yeah, I'll refer to City Clerk.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is an option. My presumption was, and I may have presumed incorrectly, that any closed session deliberations would just be providing further information that can't be disclosed in public regarding the specifics of some of the hotline inputs. But if committee wishes, we can stand down this motion and deal with it after rising and reporting from closed session.
Yeah, and I'm fine with that. Are you okay with that, Councillor Plushing, then? Is that what you would prefer?
Yeah, I think we should vote on it after we have all the information. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll do that. And so City Clerk, for us to move on to item 6.2?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think Councillor Santos, you held status of management action plan?
I did, and mostly all of my questions were dealt with. One final question with respect to the management action plan has to do with Appendix 2, which shows the map of the different action plans for management, and it does say review of councillor budget and staffing model, as well as review of councillor budget and staffing model with respect to expense claims and expenses. That seems to be completed, but I think we also, to the point of the questions I asked earlier, we need to review the respectful workplace policy of councillor and the staffing model, and identifying those loopholes and gaps that allow members of council to get away with what would otherwise be HR policy that they would have to abide by as managers and board of directors of the corporation. Those are all my comments, but I don't know if HR in your policy review, if there's anything to do with that and identifying the gaps in processes with respect to the code of conduct for the members of council.
Through the chair to Councillor, no, we don't actually have that process embedded. We will be coming forward within a couple of weeks with a revised policy. It still applies to the council office, councillors and mayor included, but it doesn't actually determine the discrepancies of how it applies to council. There was also the Code of Conduct for Employees Administrative Directive, which was just approved last week. We have done a review to identify where the gaps are. Perhaps this is work we can take up with the City Clerk's office to make sure there's better alignment between the Council Code of Conduct and the Employee Code of Conduct and the Respectful Workplace Policy.
Yeah, and I think, thank you, Sandeep. I think an important piece here is also identifying the gaps in the process. Like, for example, what I highlighted, if there's an employee who has an HR-related complaint and it's referred to the IC and the IC doesn't deal with it, then what? That's a huge gap in the process, like especially within the political model that we have set up for members of council. So I'm not sure if we require a motion on that to add that as part of a management action plan somehow. I'll look for direction from the clerk in terms of how to put that forward, or if Sandeep, you can just take that as directions to include in your review of the process and procedures.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll pass it back to Peter Fay to provide guidance on what's the best approach to move forward.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I wonder if perhaps that could be an item that could be raised at the Governance Committee, which is scheduled to meet, I think, next Monday, March 1st. Or as I think I understand where the questions you're asking, Councillor Santos, and those may also be questions that may come up when the Integrity Commissioner comes before Council on March 24th. And in the meantime, as the Director of HR had stated, we'll work with the Director and staff in terms of identifying linkages and gaps and resolving those gaps should they exist between the Employee Code of Conduct, the Council Code of Conduct, and the Respectful Workplace Policy.
Great, I'm happy to bring that forward for Governance Committee. I don't sit on that committee, so I'm going to turn to my partner, Councillor Vicente, to make sure that that is added. Or Mr. Clerk, if you can please note that I would like to have that discussion item added to the Governance Committee, and I'll sit in as a councillor to provide comment about it.
Thank you. That's noted to be added to that agenda for next week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Councillor Santos. Are there any further questions or comments? No? Okay. We now go on to, if I'm not mistaken, item 8.1. Is that right, City Clerk?
Through you, Mr. Chair. 8.1 was added to consent.
Okay.
And now we're on item 9, question period for members of committee. Okay.
So do any members, or do we want to go in camera before we go to the question period and public question period?
You may, if that's the will of committee, yes.
Okay, so I would rule that. How much time do we need? 10 minutes?
Mr. Chair, yes, 10 minutes. And just, the motion then would be to move into closed session to deal with an open meeting exception under section 239(2)A of the Municipal Act, the security of the property of the municipality or local board, and this is in relation to item 6.1 on today's agenda.
Okay, and moved by Councillor Willens, or anyone opposed? No, okay, so we will, it's 10:24, so does 10:40 work for you? Is that enough time, Peter?
Mr. Chair, yes, that would be appreciated.
Okay, so at 10:40, everyone to reconvene on in camera. Thank you.
Thank you, members of committee. This meeting is now recessed. Members, you can leave the WebEx session, and you did receive a separate email for joining the Microsoft Teams closed session. Please, just a reminder as of today for the team session, you will be waiting in the lobby until you're admitted entry into the session, as we'll be starting a new process in terms of gating those that are coming into the meeting. Thank you, and we'll see you in closed session. So, Mr. Chair, it is 11:10. You do have a quorum present, and you can resume the meeting.
We ready to go, City Clerk? Or?
Yes, Mr. Chair, you can proceed.
Okay, thank you very much. So we are now in open session, and I do believe I see a request from Member Zaman. You would like to amend the proposed motion regarding the hotline?
Yes, Mr. Chair. I think there was a draft of the motion that was put together by the clerk. I'm happy with that aspect of it. Just wanted to add on one or two things very quickly. So the first thing that I just wanted to add on was just coming from the discussion that we had earlier in this meeting, was just a request for internal audit to actually research and report back about the whistleblower policies here at the city as well. I'm not sure if that can be added on as part B to this motion, or that lends itself more to a separate motion. I'll look to the clerk for direction on that. And the second thing was just a request to put some sort of timing parameters around it, and I don't want to impose any undue burdens on the internal audit function. So I'm not sure if it's appropriate to report back at the next audit committee or the following one. I'm happy to work with internal audit on that timing aspect of it.
So through you, Mr. Chair. So if Member Zaman is adding an additional motion regarding research and have staff research and report back on the whistleblower policy and procedures. And in terms of timing for that report, it could be to the next audit committee meeting, which is currently scheduled for May 4th, or the one after that, which would be in September, I believe. And but that would be subject to any comment from internal audit on that.
Through the chair, if I may, if we're simply looking at reporting back on if there is a policy and what's included in the fraud policy, then we can report back on May 5th.
Yes, thank you so much. So what I was actually looking for is an overview of that policy. If you'd be able to give this committee a walkthrough of what that policy entails, or how employees are protected specifically, that overview would actually be useful, and not just the referral to the fact that it exists.
My understanding is that there is no whistleblower policy. I would want to confirm that for myself, but my understanding is that there is not. So unless someone knows differently, just so we can manage the expectation.
So I guess the takeaway from that would be, I personally think that, given that we do have these avenues of, complainants to come forward, whether it's through hotlines, and I'm sure there's other internal sort of reporting procedures there as well. I really think it's a good idea for the city to consider having a whistleblower policy that protects employees from reprisals should they come forward, right? So again, once you go back and research this, if there is not a whistleblower policy that exists, then I'd want some sort of, I'd want internal audit to be able to come forward with a recommendation around whether it should exist or not, or what that policy should entail.
Go ahead, staff.
Through the chair, I believe there's work going on to look at the different policies right now. So what I can commit to doing for sure is to talk to other members of the CAO's office on what work's being done on these policies. They can come back to it. I'm not sure if drafting a whistleblower policy would be part of internal audit's role, but we could provide recommendations based on research.
I agree with that. I think that's exactly what I was looking for, is a recommendation from internal audit whether one should exist. And if one does exist, typically, generally benchmarking to other organizations, what does that policy entail? Obviously, drafting that policy, I think, would reside that responsibility would reside with management, I think. But any recommendations that internal audit would have, I think that's exactly what I'm looking for here.
Chair?
Yep.
I believe
Go ahead.
Sorry. I
That's
believe
it.
we could provide something by May 5th.
Okay, and great. Any, so I think that's pretty clear now. City Clerk, is this part of that one motion, or would you suggest we separate these?
Through you, Mr. Chair, it's part of the same item, so it's identified as a separate motion within the same item for discussion. So I think it's appropriate to consider at this time. Now, whether the committee wishes to take separate votes on these or deal with them as a package, that will be up to committee.
Okay. So members, Evan, are you fine? I have another, any further comment?
No further comments from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Palashi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this conversation we're having around the whistleblower policy is familiar. I believe it was you, Mr. Chair, that brought this forward last term and asked for the policy to be implemented. So I'm not sure where that is. Maybe we can look back at last term to dust off those discussions, just to bring them back for council, for this committee's awareness. As for where we are with the current motion, the way it lies before us here, it's that we're going to continue on with the option one, and then staff understand that given what's currently happening at council discussing about the future of internal audit, at that time they'll come back with a recommendation on the public portion of the prevention hotline. Is that correct?
Through the chair? Yes, once the dust is settled, as it were, on the different initiatives, then we'll be able to come back and make a recommendation.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Palashi. So I do have a motion and that would encompass two parts, and I would suggest, City Clerk, if we can have a recorded vote, unless anyone wants separating them, but it seems everyone's fine to deal with them as a package. So I would ask for a recorded vote, Peter.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to members of committee, a recorded vote's been requested on the motion on item 6.1 as shown on the screen. All in favor, please indicate. Councillor Santos?
Yes.
Councillor Willens?
Yes.
Councillor Palashi?
Yes.
Councillor Bowman?
Yes.
Councillor Singh?
Yes.
Member Jane?
Yes.
Member Zaman?
Yes.
Chair Medeiros?
Yes.
Mr. Chair, that motion carries unanimously 8-0.
Okay, great. So our next item is councillor question period. Do any members or member question period, do any members have any questions? No? Okay, our next one is public question period. Do we have any questions, Peter?
Mr. Chair, I'm just checking at the moment, and I do not see any. I should advise that we should go back to item 6.2. That item was discussed before we moved into closed session, but we did not take a vote on receiving the status of management action plans.
Okay. So I believe it was Councillor Santos who held it. So the motion is moved by Councillor Santos to approve the staff report, item 6.2, that the report titled Status of Management Action Plans December 31st to the Audit Committee meeting of February 23rd be received. Is there anyone opposed to this motion? No. Okay, motion carries. So again, question period, there are no questions. Public question period, there are no questions. And I believe closed session, do we need to report on that again?
Yes, Mr. Chair. So just to report out on behalf of committee that item, committee moved into closed session for the open meeting exception under section 2392A of the Municipal Act regarding the security of the property of the municipality or local board. In regard to item 6.1 on today's agenda, information was received in closed session and no direction was provided.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next item is adjournment. So our next scheduled meeting is Tuesday, May 4th, 9:30 a.m. I do have a motion moved by Member Zaman to adjourn today's meeting and that we meet again on Tuesday, May 4th. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to staff and everyone. Please stay safe, stay healthy, practice physical distancing, and wear a face covering. Thank you very much.
Thank you, members of committee. This meeting is now adjourned. We're just waiting for the live stream to end momentarily.